The room was dim, lit by the soft glow of a lamp on the dresser, its shade slightly crooked no matter how many times I tried to straighten it. Outside, the wind brushed against the old maple tree, and I could hear its leaves whispering against the window like they were trading secrets of their own. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, folding laundry that had already been folded once before. At my age, you find comfort in small routines. They anchor you. I'm a woman in my 50s now, old enough to have lived several versions of myself, young enough to still feel surprised by life. That night, I was wearing my favorite sweater, the soft one with the frayed cuff, and thinking about nothing in particular. Then there was a knock. Not the firm knock of an adult, not the careless tap of a child, but something in between. I knew who it was before I even answered. "Come in," I said. My grandson stepped inside, pausing just past the doorway as if he wasn't sure he was welcome. He's tall now, taller than I expect every time I see him, with shoulders that haven't quite decided if they belong to a boy or a man. His hair was still damp, probably from a rushed shower, and his eyes carried that familiar restlessness I'd seen growing in him over the years. "Can I sit?" he asked, nodding toward the chair near my bed. "Of course," I said, patting the mattress instead. "You don't have to ask in your own grandmother's room." He smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat beside me, leaving just enough space between us to feel polite, not distant. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and for a moment we just sat there, listening to the house breathe. I went back to folding, giving him the gift of silence. I've learned that people speak more freely when they don't feel rushed. After a while, he cleared his throat. "Grandma," he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not fear exactly, more like courage that hadn't been tested yet. "Yes," I replied, still folding, still calm. He looked around the room at the photos on the wall. Me in my younger days. Him as a baby in my arms. His parents smiling, tired and hopeful. His gaze lingered there, and when he spoke again, it was softer. "Do you ever feel like people think they know you, but they only know the version you let them see?" That made me stop. I set the shirt down carefully and turned toward him. "All the time," I said. "I think that's part of being human." He nodded, staring at his hands now. His fingers twisted together, then apart. I could almost see the thoughts lining up, waiting their turn. "I don't talk much," he said. "Not about real things." "I've noticed," I answered gently. "But I've also noticed you listen. That counts for something." He let out a small breath, like he'd been holding it in longer than he realized. "Sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to be someone I don't fully understand yet." Those words landed heavier than he probably intended. I saw myself in them. The years I spent being a wife, a mother, a worker, a caretaker, before I ever stopped to ask who I was beneath all that. I reached over and placed my hand on his, slow and deliberate, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. He didn't. His hand was warm, steady. "It's okay not to have all the answers," I said. "At any age." He finally looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing me not just as his grandmother, but as a person with a past, with doubts and choices and quiet regrets. And in that look, I felt a bridge forming between us. Not something fragile or strange, but something honest. We sat there for a long time after that, the lamp humming softly, the night deepening outside. I didn't know yet where the conversation would lead, only that something important had begun. And as an older woman who's learned to respect the weight of words, I knew one thing for certain. Sometimes growth doesn't arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes it sits beside you, clears its throat, and finally decides to speak. He didn't pull his hand away, But he shifted slightly, like he was adjusting to the idea that he was being seen. I could tell this wasn't something he planned to say all at once. It was more like a door he'd finally unlocked, unsure how wide to open it. "I don't really know how to explain it," he said. "Everyone asks what I'm going to do next. School, work, life. And I give them answers, but they feel borrowed, like they belong to someone else." I nodded slowly. "Borrowed answers can get you through a conversation," I said, "but they don't always get you through a night." That made him smile, just a little. "Exactly." I leaned back against the headboard, the wood cool through the fabric of my sweater. The room felt smaller now, not in a suffocating way, but in an intimate one, like a safe harbor. The ticking clock on my dresser marked the seconds, steady and patient. "When I was your age," I began, "I thought adulthood was a finish line. You cross it, and suddenly everything makes sense. Turns out, it's more like a long road with a lot of side streets." He listened closely, the way people do when they realize you're not giving advice, just truth. "Did you always know who you were supposed to be?" he asked. I laughed softly. "No, I knew who others needed me to be. That's different." That answer stayed with him. I could see it settle somewhere deep. He looked down again, then back up, his expression open in a way that felt rare. "I feel like I'm disappointing people," he said, "even when they say I'm not." "That's a heavy thing to carry," I replied, "especially when it lives mostly in your own head." He exhaled, longer this time. "I don't really talk about this with anyone." "I'm honored you're talking about it with me," I said. And I meant it. At my age, you learn that trust is one of the most meaningful gifts there is. The lamp flickered slightly, and I reached over to steady it, the light settling again. Shadows danced softly on the walls, brushing past the framed memories. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet in my drawer, a scent I'd used for years because it reminded me to slow down. "I guess I came in here because you don't expect anything from me," he said. I turned toward him fully. "I expect you to be honest with yourself," I said. "Everything else can wait." He swallowed, eyes glistening but steady. "That's harder than it sounds." "It is," I agreed, "but it's worth it." There was a pause then, not awkward, just full. I thought about the years that had shaped me, the mistakes that had taught me more than successes ever did. I realized how rarely we tell younger people that confusion isn't a flaw. It's a beginning. "You know," I said, "some of the strongest men I've known were the ones who admitted when they didn't have it all figured out." He glanced at me, surprised. "You really think that?" "I know it," I said. "Strength isn't about certainty. It's about showing up anyway." He sat a little straighter after that. Not taller, just steadier. Like something inside him had been given permission to exist. We talked about small things after that. His classes, the job he was considering, the way the world feels louder these days, faster. I shared stories he'd never heard, about times I'd stood at crossroads and chosen paths that weren't obvious at the time. As the night grew deeper, I noticed how calm he seemed. The restless energy had softened, replaced by something thoughtful. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. Really listening." I smiled. "Anytime," I told him. "My door is always open." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet room, the echo of his words still warm in the air. I realized then that this wasn't just a conversation. It was a moment of passing something along. Not answers, but understanding. And as I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for the next generation is remind them they're not alone on the road. Sleep didn't come easily that night. After he left, I lay back against the pillows, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, as if it had absorbed our conversation and was holding it gently in its walls. I kept replaying his words, not because they worried me, but because they mattered. Sometime after midnight, I got up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps, familiar and reassuring. I've lived long enough to know that homes, like people, have voices. This one spoke in memories, birthday mornings, late-night talks, laughter and arguments that eventually softened into understanding. When I returned to my room, I noticed his door down the hall was still slightly open. A thin line of light spilled onto the carpet. I paused, not intending to intrude, just listening. There was no sound inside, only the quiet hum of thought. The next morning, sunlight filled the house early. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when he came in, looking a little tired but calmer than the day before. He gave me a small nod, a private acknowledgement of what we'd shared. "Morning, Grandma," he said. "Morning," I replied. "How'd you sleep?" He shrugged. "Not great, but lighter somehow." I smiled at that. Sometimes our minds stay busy after we tell the truth. He poured himself a cup of coffee, copying the way I had just a little milk. He sat across from me, and for a moment we just watched the steam rise from our mugs. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always." "How did you know when to speak up for yourself? I mean, really speak up." I considered the question carefully. "I didn't at first," I said. "I stayed quiet for years. I thought keeping the peace meant keeping myself small." "And then?" he asked. "And then one day," I continued, "I realized silence was costing me more than honesty ever could." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. I could tell he was connecting dots, not just about me, but about himself. Later that afternoon, we sat on the back porch together. The air was crisp, the sky wide and open. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head, staring upward. "I don't want to live on autopilot," he said suddenly. "That's a good thing not to want," I replied. "I just don't know how to stop," he admitted. "You start by noticing," I said. "Notice when something feels wrong. Notice when something feels right. Over time, that awareness becomes a compass." He was quiet after that, not closed off, just thoughtful. I watched him, this young man who carried both hope and uncertainty in equal measure, and I felt something shift inside me too. For so long, I defined myself by what I gave to others. Being needed had become my identity. But sitting there with him, I realized how much I still had to offer simply by being present, by sharing the lessons etched into me by time. That evening, we cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. He chopped vegetables with more care than necessary, and I teased him about it. We laughed, an easy sound that filled the kitchen and spilled into the hallway. As we ate, he told me about a decision he'd been putting off, a choice that scared him because it might disappoint someone else. He didn't ask me what to do. He just wanted to say it out loud. "I think I already know what I need to choose," he said. "That's usually how it goes," I replied. When the dishes were done and the day began to wind down, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the connection we were building, but for the reminder that growth doesn't belong to the young alone. That night, as I returned to my room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I saw lines and stories and strength I hadn't always recognized. I realized that listening to him had helped me listen to myself again. Sometimes the most unexpected conversations don't just guide the future. They quietly heal the past. A few days passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm, but something underneath had changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was more like the steady hum of an engine you suddenly realize has been there all along. I noticed it in the way he carried himself, and I noticed it in myself too. On the third evening after our talk, the sky turned the color of soft copper just before sunset. I was back in my room, straightening the dresser and dusting the picture frames, when I heard footsteps pause at my door again. This time there was no knock, just a gentle presence. "You busy?" he asked. "Never too busy for you," I said. He stepped in and leaned against the doorframe instead of sitting right away. He looked more sure of himself somehow, not because he had answers, but because he seemed less afraid of the questions. "I talked to my dad today," he said. I set the cloth down slowly. "How did that go?" He smiled, a real one this time. "Better than I expected." I told him I'm still figuring things out, that I need time. And he listened, he said. I think he needed permission too. That stayed with me. How often do we forget that understanding can move in both directions? That even the ones we think have it all together are quietly hoping someone will be honest with them. He came in and sat on the chair this time, facing me. The light from the window framed his face, catching the seriousness in his eyes. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me. "About not staying small." I nodded. It took me years to learn that lesson. "I don't want it to take me that long," he said gently, not accusing, just aware. "That's the gift of listening," I replied. "You don't have to repeat every mistake to learn from it." We talked until the sun slipped away, and the room filled with that soft blue light that comes just before night. He asked about my younger years, not out of curiosity alone, but out of connection. I told him about moments I'd never put into words before. Times I chose safety over truth. Times I waited for approval that never came. "I don't regret my life," I said, "but I do wish I'd trusted myself sooner." He sat quietly, respecting the weight of that honesty. There was mutual respect in the air, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and hesitated. "I'm glad you're my grandma," he said. I felt that deep in my chest. "I'm glad you're you," I answered. After he went to bed, I stayed up a while longer. The house felt peaceful, not empty. I thought about how many years I'd spent thinking my role was to guide from a distance, to offer advice only when asked, to stay in my lane. But that night, I understood something new. Connection isn't about age or authority. It's about showing up honestly when the moment asks you to. I turned off the lamp and lay down, feeling a quiet pride not just in him, but in myself. Growth doesn't stop when your hair turns gray or your routines become familiar. Sometimes it begins again when you least expect it, sitting right beside you, asking a simple question, and trusting you with an honest answer. And as sleep finally found me, I knew this was a chapter in both our lives we would carry forward, not because it changed everything, but because it reminded us of who we are becoming.